Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Julia Simpson and I am one of the psychologists here at Alpine Pediatrics, and I'm really excited to be talking with you all about this topic of resilience and building resilience in children. This is a topic that can apply to each and every one of us as parents as well as each of our kids. So hopefully you will be able to learn something. The focus is definitely going to be on tools that we as parents can use to help our kids build this resiliency. So we will talk today about what resilience is, what we mean by building resiliency, and then what we can do to help our kids be more resilient. So if we start with what is resiliency, so of course I think everyone's first answer to that is, okay, it's how we help our kids be able to tackle and cope with hard things, which is exactly right. But there's also a second part to that. It's not just like knowing when hard things come up and knowing that we need to be able to get through it, but it's also knowing how we're going to problem solve and exactly what the steps we're going to take are to get through that hard thing. So also we'll incorporate into that not just problem solving, but how we can help build strengths in our children. In terms of what is resilience and what can it do for us, so like I was saying, it's not just knowing what needs to be done, it's knowing exactly how we're going to implicate it, but the things that can be relevant to that are obviously knowing what goals we have, making those goals realistic, understanding, like I said, how to solve problems, being able to relate to ourselves and others in a respectful way, the ability to cope and the ability to bounce back. Well, and I should back up and say not just bounce back, but to get through and then bounce back from hard things. The thing about today is that I don't think there's a time right now, at least anymore, where we can completely avoid hard things. I think in the past, most people felt like resiliency was reserved for a select group of people that have just gone through maybe really isolated traumas of some sort. But the reality of today's world is that we all experience stress, hard things, challenges, almost, not necessarily every day, but fairly often. And so today, I think rather than saying like, oh, here's, what to do if you ever face a hard thing, it's like, hey, here's how to recognize when something's hard and challenging for you. And here's the things that's going to help you get through that. So this really does apply to every single person. So what we'll go through are some guideposts that I've gathered for parents that can help their kids create this resiliency and build strengths to help them be more resilient. The first thing probably sounds like a little thing, but essentially it's being and having more empathy for our kids. Sometimes people get confused by this idea of empathy because essentially empathy is being able to relate to our kids and the feelings they have. And I hear from parents sometimes that they're scared to validate or worried about validating their kids' feelings because they feel like it's going to come across as them agreeing with their feelings. But I think there is a huge difference with just telling our kids like, hey, I see you. I can see how you got to that feeling place, or I can understand your perspective right now. And we can appreciate their point of view without also conveying like, yeah, your point of view was totally correct. So I think there is a big difference there. And I honestly think that when we can validate first, our kids don't always listen, but when we can validate first, I think that does open up their listening ears a little bit more than it would if we immediately jumped over their feelings to ours and tried to kind of really convince them initially of our point of view. So the one thing that validating does is it helps them realize that they're not the only one that has had that experience. So even within reason, I think it's okay to share even examples from your own life, maybe when you were a kid, of when you made a similar mistake or had a similar experience, so that they know it's not just them and other kids, it's even their parents and the adults have been through similar things as they're experiencing. One thing to keep in mind is I know that it's easier for us because it's easier for me that to be a lot more empathic and validating when our kids are doing things really well. It's a lot harder when things are going tough or things are tough for them or between us or when they're just engaged in this long string of negative behavior. So I think the important thing is to remember to try to find that balance of not just validating them when things are positive and going great, but also when we know that things aren't going the best. The other thing is that we want to be able to communicate effectively with them as well as listen effectively. So one thing that I think I know I try to avoid is I definitely try to avoid using extreme language, like you always do this or you never do that, as well as labels. So something like you're being a bad kid, or you're being a good kid, and we'll talk a little bit more about that one later, but especially with that extreme language, because I think what the kids hear, instead of the intent behind that language, they just hear the never or always part, and they really internalize that. Like, oh, well, if I never help out, I guess that's just who I am. I don't ever help out, and so then therefore they don't try to help out again. So we really want to try to listen to their experience, understand their point of view, but then also be able to help them see other perspectives and middle grounds rather than extremes. Another thing that we can do as parents, this one in particularly, I know I've had to work on a lot, but we want to really work with challenging negative scripts or negative thoughts about ourselves and others. So this has 3 different steps to it, actually. And so the first one actually starts with us as parents. We have to challenge our negative thoughts about ourselves as parents. So, and maybe we aren't even aware that we have those, but essentially how you can be aware of this is when you feel triggered by your children, be interested in what's going on for you. What thought do you have? Does your brain jump to a place of, oh, I just don't know if I can do what they need, or I don't know if I can be a good mom or a good dad to them? Because those are probably our fears that we hold deep down as parents that may be interfering. And so what we don't realize is, particularly when things aren't going well, we tend to view what's going on through that lens, and then we just kind of perceive more failure, and then it's hard for us to be there to help our kids. The reality is that each and every one of us are the best parent possible for our kids, and it's important that we remember that and see things that way. The other thing is that we might be holding negative thoughts about our children. For example, I will use a personal example. So I have a child who has been diagnosed with ADHD, and I, for a long time before we got the diagnosis, just perceived her as really out of control and unpredictable. And then that contributed to my belief about myself, like I was mentioning a moment ago, that I was incapable of managing that level of energy and impulsivity. Once I realized that belief was going on for me about myself, but also particularly about my child, I was able to challenge that because I could start to see how it was impacting my behavior with my child. So for example, it felt like I was walking on eggshells around my child, and I was much more reactive rather than I was like feeling like I was in control and could respond in the way that I wanted to. And so instead, I started seeing the symptoms instead of allowing those symptoms or behaviors to define her. And it helped me respond to her in a way that was through the lens of my strengths and her strengths versus through both of our perceived weaknesses. The last thing is once we're better at having insight for our own negative thoughts about ourselves and about our kids, we can then help our kids. Well, we can better recognize our kids' negative thoughts about themselves and also better help them to challenge their negative thoughts. Something else that I'll mention just kind of in this same section is I'm really big on language and the language that we use with ourselves and how we talk with ourselves. So in particular, what I mean by that is I hear a lot of kids come into therapy and I'll be like, oh, how was your week? And they'll say, it was the worst week ever. And I'll kind of look at them like, really? Because you've said that the past 3 weeks. So how can they all be the worst week ever? So I think when we talk to ourselves, we have to be careful about using those extremes with ourselves as well. And it's much better to use something like, oh, I had a challenging week this week versus it was the worst week ever, because it's really going to influence the tools and our beliefs about ourselves being able to manage that. Okay. Hopefully this one goes without being said, but this guidepost is about loving unconditionally. And so the reason I include this is that I want it to be a little bit more involved than obviously just loving your child, but goes back to the language I was using a couple moments ago about good kid versus bad kid. Inherently, I don't think that's a terrible language to use. So I don't want you to feel badly if that's something that you feel like you use. But for the reason it's important to me to be careful of that is because I want to make sure that the problematic behaviors and the consequences or rewards I might be using are separate from how I define my child. And so I want them to know that no matter what, I love them. But then there's these separate things we're working on, that they might have a behavior they engaged in that I want them to learn from. And part of that learning process is I'm going to give them a consequence. But it changes in no way the way that I feel about them. So I find that really important. But also I think each of us as parents, like I said, we're the best parent for our kids, and we have to figure out and do what's best for us and use the language that's best for us. Another thing that I want to say is, I think today's world, we become so go, and it can become about, getting to the next thing. And so sometimes we forget, or we just run out of time to feel like we're being present with our kids. And so our kids get the busy, stressed version of ourselves instead of the present version of ourselves. However, how that also affects us, as we're missing out on those little fine details that we could be noticing about our kids, about like things they've learned that maybe we didn't recognize, or things they appreciate or things they love. And so I think it can really be awesome for both people. The trick is to realize that it doesn't even have to be long. It could literally be the 5 minutes every day before bed that you just take those 5 minutes to be super present, and it's going to completely have an impact positively on your relationship with each other. Another tool to work on and to help your kids with is to help them set realistic goals and expectations. So I think a lot of times, in fact, I've had several conversations, as at least for my older kids that I work with in therapy right now, it's nearing the end of a school term. And so they're coming in and they're kind of saying like, how do I set goals? I feel like I never achieve my goals. And one thing that I've noticed is a lot of kids set very all or nothing goals. So again, those extremes we've been talking about. They set these huge goals that are so fantastic, but they're kind of the end goal. And they forget about all the steps it's going to need to take there, and they're just striving for the big goal at the end. And so it's very hard for them because they feel like they're constantly maybe failing or just not quite able to reach where they want to reach. So we talk a lot about setting realistic goals and what that looks like. So for example, I sometimes talk about if you were going to go on a hike and there was like 10 stops on the hike, and ultimately we want to get to the top of the mountain or the end of the hike. But right now we're like at step 2 or stop number 2 on the hike. So we're just trying to get to stop 3 and then stop 4 and so on until we get to the end. So we kind of talk about, so what does stop 3 look like? What would be the definition of stop 3? How would we know we're there? And then that helps them kind of understand, okay, not only what are my big goals, but what are the realistic steps I need to get there? The other thing is I think we can help our kids be more in tune with and appreciative of their strengths and weaknesses, and help them learn how to use their strengths to cope with or compensate for their weaknesses. A lot of kids may come in very focused on their weaknesses and the reasons they can't do something. And so a lot of my work in therapy is to help them realize why they can do things. And so we can start that work at home as parents as well. Okay. This one is probably the one I feel most strongly about because I talk about it so much in my therapy with the kids I work with. But I feel very strongly about how we respond to mistakes. Probably because it took a long time for me to work on this and to really get better at this myself. But it also makes me sad when I see kids come in and really struggle with mistakes. So I think this is definitely one that we can work on a lot at home as well. And so one of the first things that I talk about with kids when we're working on mistakes is I explain the difference between shame and guilt. Because I think a lot of people assume they're feeling guilt when they make a mistake, which is what I hope we all feel, if we're going to feel something. But the reality is I don't think a lot of people realize they're actually feeling shame, and that's why it's been so hard to move on. And the difference is that guilt is that I made a mistake, right? Shame is more language like I'm the mistake, like I'm the reason this happened, instead of seeing like my actions resulted in this. And so again, you can see how we separate out the behavior from the person rather than assigning the behavior to the person, and then that therefore seeming like it's the symbol of their self-worth. So that's the first thing we work on, is like, wait a second, we got to actually get into the feeling that would be most appropriate here, which would be guilt. And then when we're in guilt doesn't feel great either, but guilt does feel like we can move on. And so that's where we want to get to first. Then we focus on what we have control over. So the problem is when we ruminate and really hyper fixate on our mistakes and just play them over and over again in our mind, is that we don't have control over something that already happened in the past. And so it does create that very helpless and hopeless feeling when we're trying to control something we don't have control over. So I'm not saying that we ignore mistakes or we excuse them. We acknowledge that they happen, but then we redirect our focus to what we have control over, which is, what do we want to learn from this and how are we going to apply it into the future? So that's really important. The way that I do this a lot with kids in my therapy is I usually will have them identify a teacher if they've had a favorite teacher, or a coach if they do sports, or an instructor or a director if they do something in music or dance. And I just have them talk to me about their favorite of whatever it is, teacher, dancer, dance coach, sports coach. And I have them then tell me a little bit about, oh, it sounds like that's a really awesome person. How did they respond to you when you would make mistakes, or when other people would make mistakes? Because I'm sure everyone made mistakes where you guys were going to a lot of practices. And usually they'll say exactly what I want them to say is, oh, well, they would kind of come over and kind of say, hey, I noticed that this happened, and acknowledge the mistake, but then they'd really cheer me on and they'd really direct me on, like, let's try again. Why don't you try it this way? And I was like, yes, exactly. And then we'll compare that to the way that they typically talk to themselves. And so usually with ourselves, we're so much harder on ourselves. We're very critical, very punishing in our language. And I'll kind of ask, what if your teacher or your coach, what if they talk to you in that language? And 100% of the time they're like, oh my gosh, I would not even be on that team anymore. I would not even want to be in that class. And I'm like, right, because it's so hard to learn and it makes us feel so badly about ourselves. So what I want them to get from that is we really want to try to use our own best coach voice with ourselves, or our own best teacher voice with ourselves, and not our worst quote unquote teacher voice or coach voice with ourselves. If that's hard for them to understand, the other way that I've practiced this is to ask them who is someone in their life that they really care a lot about, and to kind of flip the perspective. So if this person they care about a lot was going through this same thing, how would they talk them through it? And they would probably talk that person through it a lot more kindly than they would talk themselves through it. So we just want to try to use that voice that we use with everyone else with ourselves. The other thing as parents that we can really do that's helpful is, sometimes it's easy, especially when you're in that reactive mode. I've definitely been stuck in this myself, where I get into this putting out fires mode. I'm just like, no, stop, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. And so I'm just kind of constantly saying no, 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 but I'm not actually like redirecting or teaching what I want to happen instead. So we really want to get into the habit of not just saying no, but helping our kids learn what it is we do want them to do, not just what we don't want them to do. And then the other thing is I actually think it's really okay to be really transparent and open when you make mistakes as parents. I mean, obviously there's times that you wouldn't be, but the times that you feel like you've made a little mistake, or particularly if you feel like you've made a mistake as it relates to your child, I think it can be really powerful to own up to that, and to be, open with that about them, and just really apologize. That goes a long way with kids. I know that I'm not always the best at this either, because like I said, I'm still working on being comfortable with my own mistakes myself, But I do try, like if I had a really hard day and I can tell that that resulted in me being much more reactive with my kids, at the end of the day, I try to sit down with them and I say, listen, I can tell that today I wasn't at my best and I was responding in a way that doesn't make me very happy or proud of how I did that with you guys today. There were some things that we can all work on together, but I want you to know I'm sorry for how I responded and how I handled today. And I can just see them really feel like we can connect a lot more, and that that I'm a teammate with them, and that they can trust me to help them solve their problems, because I'm not perfect myself either. Okay. So another helpful thing as parents is if we can provide them with opportunities where they excel. So this could be just getting them involved in extracurricular activities, but it can also be noticing their strengths and really putting them in positions where their strengths are highlighted. So for example, I was talking about my child earlier. One thing that I've learned about her is she loves to help and she thrives when she's in a helping situation. And so when we're kind of in this pattern of just her seemingly, her behavior being out of control and being hard to manage for herself and for me, I'll try to, rather than just managing the behavior, redirect to a behavior that I know that she feels strong in. And so I'll just start doing a task and I'll invite her over to help. And it's like immediately we're out of that cycle because she's doing something that she really thrives in. I think when we can do this, it helps them build their own sense of responsibility. Obviously, it can build their self-esteem. And just helps them have more respect for themselves, which also then therefore helps them have more respect for others. And then lastly, I just want to comment on how we can help our children solve problems themselves. So I think it's easy, especially when us as parents, we can kind of see the solution so obviously, to just jump to this point of, okay, here's what you should do. But then never explain to the child like, okay, well, here's how we got there, or really like included them in the decision-making process. So obviously there's some decisions that just as parents, we're going to make for our kids. But the ones where we could really walk them through the steps and help them make the decision for themselves, I think can be really empowering. So the process that I like to try to use is we first identify the situation or the problem that we're up against, and then I encourage kids to make a list of all the possible solutions, even the ones that we both know are not the best. Even if it's like, oh, well, I could get really aggressive and mean and fight back. I want them to write that down, because then the next step is we're going to go through the pros and cons of as many of them as possible. And then once we have all that down on paper, I just kind of like show the paper to the child and I'm like, hey, so what do you think? Like now that we've thought through each of these individually, what would you choose? What seems the best? And sometimes we pick the top two. And then my challenge for them is, well, why don't we go try these solutions out as an experiment and you come back and let me know how they went. And this is an awesome experience because first of all, we're teaching kids to be able to problem solve and decide things on their own. But going along with that, that is a super empowering experience for them. And it builds a lot of self-confidence that they know that they are allowed to make decisions and that they can. So that's the end of the guidepost. But one last thing that I wanted to share is a lot of the attributes that have been shown in research of children to be associated with successful coping and therefore probably more resiliency. As you can tell, some of these traits or attributes on here may be things that people are just born with, but many of them are things that we can build in kids. So it's good to kind of know exactly where your kids' strengths are in terms of the attributes that as it relates to successful coping, but it's also good to pinpoint the ones that you feel like you could work on and make goals related to and help build those in your kids. Also, I should point out that the goal here isn't to have every single one of these traits. It's just to, have a solid handful, and that can help you be a lot more resilient than you may have been originally. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for being here with me to listen to this. And I hope that everyone has learned something that they can take home with you and apply maybe even to yourselves. They can help you feel better about your skills as a parent and helping your child, but also can help your children build more resiliency in their day-to-day lives.